Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar to discuss the implementation of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues education materials across all disciplines. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Bioethics Commission website in the next few days, and we will also send the link out to everyone who registered for today's webinar. My name's Hillary Wakay-Vyers, and I'm the Communications Director for the Bioethics Commission, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by Misty Alt-Anderson, Research Analyst and our Bioethics Education Lead, Karen Marr, Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Bioethics Commission, and Nicole Strand, Research Analyst here at the Commission. You will hear first from Misty, who will give a brief overview of the Bioethics Commission and the educational materials on offer for free use. And then Karen, Misty, and Nicole will demonstrate the use of specific Commission modules in philosophy, science, and law settings. We will then open it up for questions. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping requests. Please keep your phone muted throughout the webinar. If you don't know where your mute button is, press *6. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the online chat feature. You will see the chat box at the top of your screen. Please type your question in that box, select all panelists, and click Send. You may submit your question at any time during this webinar. We have a team on hand to troubleshoot any technical problems you may be having with the sound or with slides. Please send a chat message to host if you are having any problems, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot. With that, I will turn it over to Misty to begin our presentation. Misty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hillary. I'm excited to be here today and to demonstrate for you a variety of ways to use the Bioethics Commission's educational modules in different disciplines. Now, before we begin, I'd like to provide some brief background information on the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues and some of the Bioethics Commission's recommendations about education. After that, we will discuss the implementation of 2 of the informed consent modules. The Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues was created in 2009 by executive order. The Bioethics Commission has 11 members with expertise in many fields, including philosophy, law, medicine, science, and theology, reflecting the multidisciplinary nature of the field of bioethics. Now, over the past few years, the Commission has had the occasion to deal with a variety of topics that you see listed here on the left. Through their analysis and reports on these topics, the Commission strives to educate the public about these issues and provide materials that will help them do so. These materials include primers, which guide the implementation of some of their recommendations, integrated topical modules that span the reports that they have produced, study guides that focus on particular reports and the issues that are addressed in those reports, and a collection of data that they have generated through their research that can then be used for further original research. The Bioethics Commission has produced 6 reports to date, and the current project that the Commission is addressing is on neuroscience and ethics. In those reports, there have been numerous recommendations that address bioethics education. One recommendation in the New Directions report on synthetic biology addressed who should receive bioethics education. Due to the multidisciplinary nature of emerging fields such as synthetic biology, bioethics reaches well beyond the traditional fields of medicine and clinical research to include additional disciplines such as engineering and materials science. The Commission concluded that all members of the research team should have some training in bioethics and called for the development of meaningful training requirements and models for this type of education. In the Moral Science Report, the Bioethics Commission recommended the development of rigorous coursework in research ethics for the undergraduate, graduate, and professional levels in order to ensure ethical design and conduct of human subjects research. Finally, in our most recent report, Anticipate and Communicate, which considers the ethical management of incidental and secondary findings, the Bioethics Commission recommended the development of educational materials that will inform all manner of stakeholders, including the public, about the ethical, practical, and legal considerations raised by incidental and secondary findings. The Commission is committed to the implementation of its own recommendations and demonstrates this commitment, for example, by developing and making freely available bioethics educational resources. The goals of these materials are to support ethics education and to facilitate the integration of bioethical analysis into existing curricula. The Bioethics Commission's educational materials are written for the instructors rather than for the students. They're designed to be flexible for use in traditional classrooms in many disciplines. Also, in non-traditional educational settings, for example, seminars, journal clubs, and ethics training courses, and in professional settings such as professional development and further training courses. All of the Bioethics Commission educational materials are available through our website, bioethics.gov. You can get there by selecting the Education tab, which you see circled here on the screen. The menu on the left of your screen allows you to select the type of materials that you want. Materials are grouped as modules by topic or by report, study guides and other resources, or through a list of all materials by Bioethics Commission report. Individual materials can be accessed through these groupings on separate pages. As you can see on the right of your screen, which shows the page listing modules by topic, there are additional informed consent modules relating to the Bioethics Commission reports, in addition to those we will discuss today, in case you are interested in additional resources on the topic of informed consent. Additional modules and materials are under development and will be available on the website on a rolling basis. Now that you are familiar with our educational materials, I'd like to hand the presentation over to my colleague Karen Maher to discuss the implementation of two of our informed consent modules in a philosophy course. Karen.
Thanks, Misty. As Misty said, each of us will be discussing how to use two of the Bioethics Commission modules in three different educational settings. So to get us started, I'm going to show how I use the modules to modify an existing course syllabus in philosophy. This is an image of the table of contents for the Informed Consent Background module. Remember that all these materials are available online at bioethics.gov. I'll be pointing out which sections I used, so you can reference these modules later. This is an image of the table of contents of the Informed Consent module for privacy in progress in whole genome sequencing. Unlike the background module, which provides a general overview, this module provides instructors with teaching materials on topics addressed in a Bioethics Commission report. This is the syllabus that I started with. The original syllabus was developed for an introductory course in bioethics for undergraduates. And as an upper-level course in philosophy, I tend to get a variety of different students in the course. So I get students from philosophy, but I also, because of the subject matter, get a lot of students who are pre-professional and have a lot of coursework in science. In the first week of the course, I provide an introduction to moral theory through discussions of medical paternalism. And students are really interested in these questions of what kinds of information or how much information patients really need to make decisions about their health. And these discussions continue into the second week. And this was the particular part of the course that I wanted to change. So in the original syllabus, these discussions were still continuing to happen about informed consent in a clinical context. And I thought it would be really interesting to use the Commission modules to change the context to research and ask what kind of information and how much information might be really different in another context. I used both additional resources section of the modules. So on the left, you can see the one that's the background module, and on the right, you can see the one for privacy in progress in whole genome sequencing. These are the materials that I selected. So at the bottom, you can see two different articles. One's a background article on the left, and one that's more in the applied genomic research on the right. You can also see on the top right that these specific modules point to different excerpts from the Commission report. I liked the pages selected here because they provided a broad overview of these complex issues in genetic research. In addition, since I was already in the report, I decided to take a look at the introduction. Because I have students coming from a lot of different backgrounds, I thought it would be helpful if each student came to the class with the same basic information. The nice thing about the pages in the introduction is that I selected pages that addressed both basic values that are at play, including trying to understand the importance of furthering genomic research, and in addition, privacy concerns that individual participants might have about sharing their genetic information. In addition, I also was able to select some pages that provided basic science information about the technology and genetic information. These are the areas of the background module that I use also to inform how I would conduct the actual course. So one of the things that I think instructors keep in mind when they're modifying a course is not merely to update the information, but to keep in mind the dynamics that are happening in the classroom. And so for my students, this is actually in week 2. And they're still getting used to sharing their ideas and defending their positions in front of other students. And I was giving a lecture on the history of informed consent that corresponded really well to this timeline. But I was finding that later on, discussion was slow to start amongst my students. So I decided to use the timeline in combination with the glossary of terms in order to select some key concepts that I thought students would be able to bring to class. So I would have to assign these concepts in advance. For example, I might ask some students to think about what the Nuremberg Code is, or other students to look up the Declaration of Helsinki. I would also ask some students to identify some key terms. What's an institutional review board? What's the common rule? By assigning these key concepts in advance, I would then have students come to class prepared, and they could actually teach each other these important aspects. I then drew from the discussion questions and exercises in the background module. Here, the discussion question prompts students to think about basic understandings of what information is needed in order to give informed consent and research. Importantly, the guidance here is provided for instructors, so you can modify them for your own purposes. In addition, for these exercises, I wanted students to think about what the institution required in terms of what information and how much information is required for informed consent and research. So I was going to have them go look up what the college or what the university suggested for researchers to include and compare to their own ideas of what's required and compare to these basic understandings. These are the areas that I chose to select to help inform discussion in Privacy in Progress and Whole Genome Sequencing module. This discussion question includes starting points for instructors, but I really tailored them to my own purposes. So in this particular case, I wanted students to think about the prospect of consenting to one research study that used genomic material, and then also consider giving permission to researchers to use that material for future research. And because researchers don't always have precise details about what they're going to do in their future research, they might not be able to provide the same degree or amount of information to participants. So I wanted students to think through why that might be okay, why it might be perfectly acceptable in one circumstance to need a lot of information, but maybe in a different circumstance, not as much. Lastly, I wanted to place students in the position of IRB members to think through the different roles that they play and the ways in which moral considerations can take a different weight depending on your perspective. So I found this particular consent to participate in research form for whole genome sequencing, and I wanted to ask students to evaluate it from various different perspectives. So in groups, I thought one person could think about evaluating the form from the perspective of a psychologist or a community member of an IRB or a genomic researcher, and to think about how they might evaluate the form in different ways. This is the revised syllabus, complete with group key concepts that would be assigned in advance and revised readings. And I'd now like to turn this over to Misty.
Thank you, Karen. Now that Karen has discussed with you how these modules might be implemented in a philosophy classroom, I'd like to demonstrate for you how the same two modules, the Informed Consent Background and the Informed Consent Privacy and Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing module, might be used in an undergraduate science course. Now, these modules could be integrated into a traditional science course, such as general biology, genetics, molecular or cellular biology, or any number of elective courses, or also in an undergraduate research seminar, which would be an interesting application, and we'll discuss that shortly. Now, to integrate a discussion about the ethics of informed consent into a traditional science course, the first question that any instructor is going to go to is, where does it fit? Right, this is new ground for many instructors. There's a natural fit in any discussion that an instructor might have about human genetics, which might address genetic and genomic testing, genetic disorders and diseases, the development of treatments and the clinical trials they have to go through before they can be approved, and even applications of personalized medicine. The Informed Consent Background module is a really great place for the instructor to start. It provides foundational information to introduce the topic of informed consent in research to students. I would emphasize that the informed consent process is supported by the ethical principle of respect for persons and participant autonomy. This is the heart of informed consent. I would briefly outline for students the history of federal regulations about informed consent, the common rule, the role of institutional review boards in reviewing genetic and genomic research with human participants. I would then address some of the challenges to informed consent in this type of research. These challenges include relaying quite complex information to the lay participant, avoiding undue inducement, and the possibility of incidental findings or secondary findings that might arise in the research. After a brief introduction to the topic itself, the Informed Consent and Privacy and Progress module provides information that will then help the instructor to focus more specifically on genetic and genomic applications. These will include biobanking and the need to link genomic data with medical information from the participant in research, and how this can be handled in a protective manner through de-identification and anonymization of those samples or data. Now, the modules provide various exercises, including discussion questions and other activities that we'll talk about as we go through here. So the discussion questions that are provided here engage students on the topic of informed consent. These I've selected from both modules. The first one is from the background module, and the second question comes from the privacy and progress module. The more general question, the first one, addresses why obtaining informed consent is considered a process rather than just a form to be signed. Now, this is a really important point for students because it demonstrates the difference between regulatory compliance, which might be satisfied by a signed form, and the ethical nature of engaging in a process to make sure that a research participant is truly informed about the research they are considering participating in. The second discussion question that you see here is a more context-specific question and inquires about the importance of an individual participant's preferences about their samples or genomic data, and how a researcher might obtain those preferences and seek to respect those preferences. The modules also provide problem-based learning activities that describe case study scenarios that students can consider in more depth. For example, this case that you see describes how a participant might react to information that his biological samples might be shared and used in future research that is unrelated to the study he is considering. The case allows students to see this from the participant's point of view, why it might be surprising to them, and how to consider the participants' concerns. The students are asked to interpret the information provided and to determine how a researcher might be able to explain and clarify this information for the participant. So moving from a traditional classroom setting to the setting of an undergraduate research seminar, you can handle much of the same information in a slightly different way. In an undergraduate research seminar, again, the question is always, where does it fit in, given that there are topics that the instructor is going to want to cover. And again, in a research seminar, the topic of informed consent fits into any discussion about human subjects research, but also into a more broad discussion about genetic and genomic research. It relates to all of the topics that you see here that we discussed earlier. Now, with undergraduate research students, the discussion, again, would start with the basics about informed consent, because chances are they're not well versed in this. And I would also address the underlying ethical principles of the informed consent process in research. It is also important to relay how ethical informed consent processes foster trust in research. I would make this a bigger point with the research students because they are engaging in research. Fostering this trust is vital to the progress of scientific research, and I think most of the students would agree with that point. And this is especially the case with genetic and genomic research. I would also address the applicable regulations and the historical research events that led to the implementation of the regulations. You saw some of these on the timeline that Karen showed you earlier. In addition, I would also bring in a discussion of the common challenges encountered in the informed consent process with genetic and genomic research. Likely, the research students will be more keyed into this since they will be involved in the research themselves. Drawing from the Informed Consent and Privacy in Progress module now, the instructor can again focus on informed consent in genetic and genomic research. Additionally, the instructor might go into more depth considering the various models for obtaining informed consent. These models include an opt-in, opt-out, broad, and tiered consent structure, and the advantages and disadvantages for each can really present an opportunity for really in-depth discussion among students. The Bioethics Commission recommendations regarding informed consent from Privacy in Progress, the report, are provided in the module and provide further discussion points. Recommendations 3.3 and 3.4 that you see here address informed consent and how it pertains to the communication of incidental and secondary findings, and how funders of research should handle individual preferences of those providing the biological samples or genomic data that will support ongoing research. Pertinent discussion questions out of this educational module engage student researchers that are in the seminar to discuss ways to ascertain participant preferences, how much the participants might be informed about future research uses of their samples or data, and how much control participants might expect to maintain over future research use of their samples or data. This problem-based learning activity that you see here provides a description of and additional reading on the BioView database maintained at Vanderbilt University. The questions ask students to find some information and identify which informed consent model is used by the BioView group, and then consider how the individual privacy of participants is reconciled with the need to advance scientific research in this example. It's a great case study in how both are really addressed. Finally, with undergraduate student researchers, I would use this exercise, which is much broader, from the Informed Consent and Privacy in Progress module, which asks students to read a background article and then find examples online of whole genome sequencing informed consent forms. The students are then asked to assess the consent forms by using a set of guided questions and then suggest improvements to the form that might be more informative to the participants of the study. Now, wrapping that up, I would like to turn this over to my colleague, Nicole Strand, who will discuss with you the use of these modules in the law school setting.
Thanks so much, Misty. So my colleagues have demonstrated how these two modules can be used to teach science and philosophy courses. And as Misty just said, I'm going to demonstrate how the modules can be used to teach future lawyers in a one-time training or lunch and learn type setting. And I think that this really puts the cherry on top of the versatility of these modules. So many law schools lack a curriculum in FDA law or bioethics or health law or the history of legal protections for human subjects of research. But there are many opportunities for lawyers to do work using the common rule or its FDA counterpart, and to have a hand in human subjects research, whether in compliance or perhaps one day working to change the system or the regulations themselves. So using these modules is a good way to get law students interested in human subjects research and health law as a part of their career. Human subjects protections like informed consent can also be a window into interesting facets of the law that law students may have heard about, and can be an interesting real-world application of some of the concepts that students may have learned about in class. So for example, the reach of the common rule, and therefore the reach of the federal government's authority to require informed consent in research, is an interesting example of federalism and federal government versus state powers. In addition, law school classes can sometimes teach the state of the law without explaining how or why it came to be. Teaching bioethics at a law school and showing how ethical and bioethical principles and tenets were turned into regulations can give students a foundation for why the law is the way it is. All of which is to say that using these Bioethics Commission modules in a law school setting might be particularly beneficial to law students. Genetics in particular, I think, is a good way to get law students interested because it's a current hot topic and it's been in the news a lot lately. And law students may have been following the news about 23andMe and the recent FDA warning letter. So for a bit of brief background on that, 23andMe is a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company. And the FDA determined that the products that 23andMe sold, which were the genetic testing services, are a device under FDA's regulations because they're intended to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent, or mitigate disease. So FDA ordered 23andMe to stop selling the tests until it applies for a device application through the agency and gets approved. This way the agency can have some degree of oversight over the tests and how they're marketed and their validity. The tension between FDA and 23andMe raises some interesting legal and regulatory issues, and even law students not well versed in bioethics or health law might have a sense of some of these issues that have cropped up in the news. So holding a lunch and learn lecture about informed consent for genetic research definitely might pique students' interest in this area. In introducing the lunch and learn, it might be helpful to start the students off with a brief history of informed consent. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I just want to note that especially for law students, understanding a little bit about the background and the history behind a regulatory requirement would be for most of them a perspective that they haven't heard much about in class. And it would allow them to consider the ethical basis of the law, which can easily be lost sight of in law school. Similarly, using the timeline is a good way to show how ethics can turn into law over time. Often law students are taught about the state of the law as it stands now and can lack an understanding in what went into making it. It's also an interesting case study in how long it can take for ethics to develop into law. As you can see in this timeline, the human subjects research ethical atrocities in Tuskegee, Alabama, took place from the 1930s to the early 70s. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects issued the Belmont Report, which developed guidelines for a federal law governing human subjects research in 1978, and the current iteration of the Common Rule, which is the basic set of human subjects protections in place today, wasn't published until 1991, almost 20 years after the end of the syphilis study in Tuskegee. Showing students this figure from the module can help them understand the scope of regulations and the reach of the federal government's power over human subjects research. And it's also a good opportunity to explain the scope of federal regulation in general and to demonstrate the reach of the federal government. This is one of the discussion questions from the Informed Consent and Privacy in Progress module, and it instructs teachers to lead a discussion about informed consent for genetic research. This is a good opportunity to teach law students about one of the interesting things about informed consent, which is that it applies and must be employed in all kinds of human subjects research, but that it has to be adapted to fit each kind of research study, which can be very varied. The students can have a discussion about genetic research studies in particular. What would informed consent require in a genetic research study? Specifically, this question asks, what are the risks related to working with genetic information? This question would lead students into a really interesting discussion about some of the things that are unique about genetic information and how a very broad federal regulation can be expected to protect participants in a range of different kinds of research that can be conducted. So hopefully this discussion would lead students to discuss some of the sensitive information that could be associated with genetic information, like discovering non-paternity, discovering susceptibility to a potentially stigmatizing disease, which could lead to discrimination, and implications for biological family members. Next, Many, but not all, law schools are embedded within research universities, and for ones that are not, teachers could develop a workaround for this exercise. This exercise is particularly helpful for future lawyers because it asks students to actually try to find informed consent forms or requirements at an institution. So this is a good exercise in the kind of research that lawyers might have to do, digging through websites, trying to figure out how institutions do something, and whether they're compliant with the regulations. At the bottom of the slide here is a copy of the informed consent requirements directly from the Common Rule. And I highlighted two aspects that it would be interesting to follow up on with law students. First, a teacher might ask them whether the description of the risks is accurate in the informed consent document that they've pulled from their institution. And second, a teacher might ask them to find the statement in the informed consent document that describes what researchers are going to do to protect the confidentiality of a participant's data and personal information, and determine if that's adequate. One thing that might be especially interesting with the law student group is to ask them to think about these questions from two perspectives. So first, if they were a participant in genetic research, would they feel like the informed consent form was satisfactory? Do they feel like the form really helps the research participant understand the risks and the confidentiality protections that are in place? But second, from a regulatory perspective, do they feel that the form is compliant with the regulations? And here they might find that they come up with two very different answers. That the form is compliant, but that it doesn't do a very good job of protecting or informing participants. And this is an interesting exercise in demonstrating to law students the difference between ethics and the law, that there is only so much that the law can do to protect people, and the existence of this regulatory framework doesn't automatically render a research process ethically sound. And finally, I wanted to demonstrate how the pedagogical materials can lead teachers into the rest of the Bioethics Commission's products and also assist in teaching. The Informed Consent and Privacy and Progress module is excerpted on the top left. And you'll notice that the module mentions that a privacy concern associated with genetic material is that someone could pick up a discarded coffee cup and send in a DNA sample to a company to surreptitiously determine the makeup of one's DNA. I can imagine a teacher reading this and being curious about it, especially because of the use of the word legally and wanting to seek more information. So using Privacy in Progress, the report itself, a teacher could learn a little bit more about this legal loophole. And it turns out that there are actually companies online that offer this service. And so at the bottom of the slide here is a screenshot from an actual website that explains how to obtain someone's DNA without them knowing and send it in order to learn something about them, such as to determine their paternity. And so the Commission was concerned about this, and in order to determine whether the practice was legal, the Commission conducted a 50-state survey of how genetic information is protected and published the results in Privacy in Progress. And this is a map of the results in the back of Privacy in Progress. The survey revealed a patchwork of protection at the state level, as you can see in the map. And it's an interesting case study, again, in federalism for law students, understanding what is the domain of the federal government and what is the domain of states. And instructors could use this figure to demonstrate the variation that sometimes can occur at the state level. So students could discuss the implications of such variety. So for example, you might be protected from secret genetic testing in Florida, but cross the border into Georgia and you may not be. Or a person might be able to take your DNA sample in one state as long as the lab they send it off to for analysis is in another state. And so finally, teachers could develop their own exercise based on the materials that are not explicitly written in the modules. In other words, the pedagogical materials are not meant to be closed loops. They're meant to lead a teacher into the other materials available from the Commission, including reports, blogs, our history page, and other resources that are available. So one could easily see designing a legal research and bioethics exercise using this chart that's available in Privacy in Progress. A teacher would ask students to use the citations provided here to look up statutes of the state that they're from and figure out what would be legal and prohibited in their state, and this is the kind of legal research that these law students will soon be very familiar with. And since this table in Privacy in Progress is based solely on statutes that explicitly protect genetic or genomic data, students could also brainstorm other kinds of legal protections that might be in place to prohibit or deter this kind of surreptitious testing practice. So for example, tort law or other kinds of statutes that might protect the privacy of health-related data, which might include genetic information. And so then again, as an exercise in the difference between legal compliance and ethical soundness, the teachers could ask not just whether surreptitious genetic testing would be legal in a particular state, but also whether they feel that the protection is adequate. Do they think the practice should be prohibited? And how might one go about enacting a law in a particular state? So hopefully my talk has demonstrated how the Bioethics Commission modules can be used not just to teach law students about legal protections, but also to facilitate them thinking about ethics as well. And I hope that I've also explained how the modules can lead teachers into other useful materials produced by the Bioethics Commission and help them creatively design bioethics education courses or seminars or trainings. And so with that, on behalf of Misty and Karen and myself, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to leave this slide up so you know how to contact us and where to access our materials. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Hillary.
Thank you, Nicole and Karen and Misty. And now let's open it up for questions. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the online chat feature. You will see the chat box at the top of your screen. Select All Panelists. State your affiliation, please. Type your question, and then just click Send. While questions are coming in, I have a couple that I'd like to pose to get us started. And Karen, I'm going to start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenge to implementing these new modules in existing courses?
So for me, an existing course syllabus, it has a structure that's determined by the original purposes for a course. So in my case, the course objectives center around communicating to my students some critical reasoning skills. And so when I'm updating a course, I have to keep in mind those course objectives. I have to think about which new material I'm going to introduce, and I have to think about how I might alter any kind of assessments that are on the other end of that. And so I think that one of the nice things about the Bioethics Commission educational modules is that they really let instructors tinker with whichever part of that process they're really interested in keying into. So that's what I really found useful about the table of contents for each module. You can sort of select the ones that jump out at you rather than trying to shoehorn in an issue in a really formatted way.
Great, thank you. Misty, this next question is for you, and we've had several questions actually that get at the heart of this, and people are wondering, can these materials be used at all levels of education? And some are also asking about their use for the lay public. Wondering if you could address that.
Absolutely, thanks, and thank you for those questions. This is a great question. Now, the Bioethics Commission educational modules were designed primarily to be flexible. We didn't try to design a specific curricula or a teaching prompt itself, and this is the main reason that we targeted these modules at the instructor and not at students. They're meant not to be prescriptive. Now, that being said, they were designed with undergraduate, graduate, and professional settings in mind, but they can be easily adapted to other levels. So the non-traditional setting can be adapted to address the lay public, and of course, in doing that, you would have to know your audience. And so what you would do is the instructor would use the background materials or the modules to choose which information was most appropriate for that audience. The thing about it is they don't have to be used as a full sum total piece of information. As Karen pointed out in her syllabus, you can pick and choose what the most pertinent information is that you need. And in that same way, teachers in, say, secondary school can also adapt the materials to work into their courses. And so the amount of depth and the level at which you teach the material can change, certainly based on the level of students. That's also the reason that we provide the different depths of activities. The discussion questions meant to be really question and answer versus the case-based scenarios, which are meant to be more student group consideration and allowing them to kind of work through some of the thorny issues without one right answer, all the way to the very broad exercises, which are really meant to put the onus on the students, so the instructors can use that to get the students to dig into the material, do some searching, do some analysis. And so we tried to provide those sorts of activities that would give all levels of interaction so that they could be used with many different groups of students.
Great, thank you for that. And Nicole, I'm going to ask you the next question. And we've had several people write in wondering why the focus on science, philosophy, and law, and what fields other than science, philosophy, and law could these modules be used in. And one specific viewer asked, do you see informed consent fitting into a medical pharmacology course, for example?
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much. I'll start with the first one, why science, philosophy, and law? And I think that the easy answer is that we are respectively a scientist, a philosopher, and a lawyer giving this talk. But of course, the reason that the three of us coming from such different backgrounds all work in this office is because of the interdisciplinary nature of bioethics. And I think the Commission has really felt and talked about in all of their recommendations the importance of teaching future scientists about how to consider ethics in their work, and the Commission feels very strongly about that. And it's also, of course, important to inject philosophical tradition with bioethical ways of thinking, both because bioethics presents novel problems for philosophy, and also because philosophy has a lot to offer to bioethics as a field. We certainly want our future bioethicists to be as well trained in philosophy as Karen has been. And finally, as I said in my talk, it's important to teach lawyers to think beyond the letter of the law and to think about the ethical basis of it. And there's a lot of law and regulation surrounding human subjects research and bioethical issues in clinical medicine as well. And, lawyers, of course, would do well to be trained in those issues for when they're entering the working world. As for other fields that you could use the modules in, I'm sure that our colleague down the hall here from a social science background would want us to mention that bioethics education is important in the social sciences as well. Bioethics is interdisciplinary, of course, and it borrows from a lot of social science, including medical anthropology, medical sociology, health economics, among a lot of other things. And of course, in addition, social science can contribute important methodological tools, particularly to empirical bioethics. And the converse is true too. Social scientists conduct research, and teaching bioethics gives them tools to consider the ethical implications of their work and how to do their research ethically. As for the question about pharmacological, what do you guys think?
I'll be happy to offer at least part of an answer to that. This is Misty, and so my answer to that would be that yes, I think it would be relevant. Now it might be the level of depth again might vary, but what I think we as scientists can agree is that science and scientific research is becoming more and more interdisciplinary as research progresses. And so while a group of pharmacology students might be very specifically in that realm while they're studying, as they move into their careers, that there might be overlap and there might be change and career growth that might take them out of that. Depending on the work that they eventually do, they might be doing research with biological samples. And so while they might not be the researcher that actually talks with the participants that donate the samples, I do think that there is a lot to be said for understanding how those samples were obtained, the process that goes into that, and really for acknowledging the fact that any time we have a biological sample, it was given by a research participant, and there was a decision there, and I think that in itself deserves respect and acknowledgement. So I think, yes, it's the sort of thing that all future researchers should be familiar with, even if they're not the ones actually interacting with the participants. I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you. And our next question comes from the University at Buffalo, and Karen, I'm going to direct this to you. Our viewer writes that he's interested in presenting for the first time a medical or scientific ethics course for college freshmen in a discovery honors type small course. And he writes, do you see a problem in that? The students will be freshmen, and separate from their skills, they will have limited philosophy and science backgrounds.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is absolutely not. So I mentioned that it was a classic introduction to bioethics, but you actually see that course in philosophy departments as a 100 level and also a 300 level. So you see it in different institutions, different ways. So freshmen are actually really well placed to come to these issues because they haven't declared what they're necessarily going to do yet. Or maybe they have an idea, but we all know they might change their majors. So that's the greatest thing, is that this type of introduction to an interdisciplinary field can really introduce them to other options that are out there. And I think that you always have to keep in mind the kind of background that your students are coming into the classroom with. And a lack of background or a lot of different types of new experiences is precisely the type of thing that I think you could tailor these modules to address. And so kind of the modules aren't designed with the idea that you know the commission reports inside and out. You can come to them without being familiar with these really new and exciting topics in bioethics and really just jump in where you are.
Great, thanks for that. And Misty, this next question is for you. And from philosophy over to science, how do you motivate science professors to do this, Misty?
That's a great question. And as a science educator myself, in my teaching, so one of the best reasons that I find to bring in any applied topic into a straight science course is simply the desire to motivate my students. Now, especially if you're teaching a survey course, such as something like general biology, it can be hard to get all of your students excited about the topic. If it's a general level course, you've got students in there that will tell you to your face they are not going to be a major and they are suffering through. And that's okay. So finding ways to link the material to current events or things that are relevant to student lives can be a really helpful hook to bring students in. Now, there are a lot of real-world applications that might serve as a hook like this, but ethical issues such as informed consent, which we discussed today, are often intriguing to students and can really draw students in, even if they don't consider themselves to be science folks. I mean, this is relevant to future citizens. I mean, when students get older, they might consider participating in research. This could be relevant to their lives, or they might have friends or family members who will participate in research. So this is a topic that it's useful to know about. In addition, students are aware that our advanced medical resources that we enjoy, certainly in our society, are dependent on research. Whether students eventually pursue a career in research is really irrelevant. All students stand to benefit in some way from advancing scientific research, and certainly can benefit from understanding the ethics of research that lead to these advances.
Thank you for that. And Nicole, over to you. What modules, if any, are coming next from the Commission?
Ooh, great question. Great chance to plug our new materials. So a recent module was just posted, I think, just a couple weeks ago. This one, a new informed consent module to accompany Anticipate and Communicate, which is our most recent report about the ethical management of incidental and secondary findings. So that's a really exciting one and a good way to continue the stuff that we've talked about today and continue on the informed consent discussions. Also supplementing our Anticipate and Communicate report, we've just posted a series of primers, and so this is a new kind of tool for us. And these primers sort of distill the analysis and the recommendations of the Commission into easy-to-read guides for a bunch of different stakeholders. So we recently posted one for IRBs, and in the coming weeks we'll be posting 6 more primers, actually, 3 for practitioners who might encounter incidental findings in their work. So that means clinicians, researchers, and direct-to-consumer providers. And also 3 for potential recipients of incidental findings, so patients in the clinic who might learn something, research participants, and direct-to-consumer consumers who are more and more learning things from these companies. And like I said, the primer we're really excited about. It's a brand new form of educational material for us, and so we're hoping that they're really easy to read and accessible and widely used. And then staff is developing a couple of other different modules that should be posted in the coming months, and we're working on brand new topics to post that go with our various reports, including something on vulnerable populations and something else hopefully on privacy. So please continue to check the website. We have lots of exciting stuff continuing to happen.
Great, thank you for that. And Karen, we have a viewer writing in from a medical center, and they want to know if they are allowed to use these modules for clinical research or staff orientation in a health system.
Yeah, no, I think that Nicole's Lunch and Learn really illustrates that these types of materials can work in a smaller session or a professional development session. So I think that the nice thing about the materials is that they aren't necessarily developed, and I think that this addresses the pharmacology question as well. I think a lot of educational materials are sometimes developed for a very particular type of teaching, and these materials really aren't developed with that kind of narrow focus. Some things like the primers are intended for a specific audience, but these modules are really intended for people to draw from a variety of different areas. And so I think, especially because the recommended readings, for example, come from lots of different disciplines, you could really find something in there that speaks to your audience.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask this question of both Karen and Misty. This will be a team question, a team approach to a team question. Do you have any recommendations for instructors who wish to team teach the materials?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's really different types of team teaching, and I'm more familiar with team teaching across disciplines. And so what I would say is that what's really challenging about that is that co-instructors have to be on the same page about the purpose of a lesson. And you can see that some of us, we all drew from the timeline, for example, or we all used really similar exercises from the modules, but we all use them in different ways. And so you just want to make sure that when you're team teaching, you're on the same page about what lesson you're actually trying to have your students learn. And so I think that these modules are nice because they illustrate and can actually help instructors model interdisciplinarity at work.
And so, yeah, if I were in the science context, sometimes you see this in survey courses where, various professors, say at the undergraduate level, will teach certain numbers of lectures throughout the semester, and they'll share their responsibility. And so what's really special about that kind of situation is that each instructor brings their own expertise to what they're going to talk about. And I would hope that each member of that teaching team would consider how a topic such as informed consent might apply in the research that they do, because that's what they bring uniquely to their teaching experience. And so if they could share that from their point of view, then the students have an opportunity to see how it applies in different ways. And those different viewpoints can really offer an opportunity to reinforce these discussions. They won't all be in depth. The first one will be the most in depth, but once students are familiar, revisiting it through the semester with different instructors can be very informative and really reinforce the idea behind it.
Great, thank you. And Karen, why don't you take this next question? It comes from a medical student who writes that she has seen, or he has seen, an unfortunate severing between clinical conversation and ethics conversation. And how can we help integrate and show the connection between ethics and clinical care without making ethics conversation as an addition as opposed to an essential?
Yeah, I think that question is really important to sort of see the ways in which people come to the material with an incomplete understanding. So I think that's the biggest key, is that it's always a challenge for me speaking to medical students or medical professionals, because I'm coming from such an extraordinarily different kind of training. And so, but I think that the trick really is all about humility, about deciding that in order for us all to do and create policies that work for patients, for research participants, we have to be able to combine our knowledge. And I think that's really the way that medicine works. I think that medicine is about calling in a consult when you really need it. And so the question is, how do we implement that in the midst of medical education, really understanding that sometimes what you need is a legal consult and sometimes what you need is a social science consult, and sort of seeing it in the ways that lots of different ways of understanding and looking at a situation are really pertinent.
Great, thank you. And Nicole, I'm going to shoot two quick questions at you, and they've been asked several times by several viewers. And they ask, who can college faculty contact at bioethics.gov for advice or direction for comments and ideas? And do they have permission to use the modules verbatim with citing bioethics.gov as the source?
Absolutely, good question. You can contact education at bioethics.gov. And we are always looking for feedback on how people are using the modules, and any kind of feedback about how it's been going. And so we're very eager to hear from you at education@bioethics.gov, and we're happy to talk to you about how you're using the modules. And the second question was of permission. Of course, you have permission to use our modules however you would like. Cite bioethics, and we have lots of citations and lots of additional readings that you can cite and that you can use. And they are free for your use, so yes, you have permission, and please do.
Great, wonderful. And I'm going to ask the last question here, and I'm going to ask all three of you to weigh in on this. Nicole, why don't you take the first stab at it, though? And just from the 30,000 10,000-foot view, why are these education materials needed?
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of the whole point, the whole reason why we're here, and we're trying to get people to know that these modules are here and start to use them, and we really think it's important. I think Misty mentioned in her talk that the Bioethics Commission has recommended all throughout its work, throughout many of its reports, that bioethics education be implemented, as we talked about, at all levels, to all different kinds of stakeholders in all different kinds of ways. And so, the reason that the Commission developed these materials is because the Commission really wants to put its money where its mouth is. And so, we started developing these materials in order to start the ball rolling on implementing all of those education-related recommendations. And, so much of what the Commission has recommended in the past relies on all stakeholders being engaged with ethical issues and understanding, both the scientific and the ethical aspects of advances in research and technology. And I think that engagement really depends on strong and sustained bioethics education at all levels, to educate future scientists about how to evaluate ethical issues, to educate philosophers on how to incorporate questions about bioethics into their work, and to educate lawyers, as I keep saying, on how to keep an eye to ethics even when working with the letter of the law. So I think that a lot of teachers want to do this, and they're just lacking a language. They're lacking a set of tools to import bioethics into their work, and that's what we're trying to do. These modules really, we're trying to help teachers from all disciplines figure out how to incorporate bioethics into the work that they're already doing.
I agree. This is Misty. I agree with everything Nicole just said, and I would also add that, the Bioethics Commission is here to advise the president on these issues, which means that when they get charged with a question and they do a thorough ethical analysis, it's because that a problem was big enough and important enough that it rose to the level of the President of the United States, which means there's an impact for all American citizens in some way or another. And because of that, the Commission spends a great deal of time thinking about and analyzing these problems in ways to be helpful. And given that is the target, they want it to not just disappear in a report somewhere on a shelf. They want this to actually be out there so people know that it's out there and can learn from it. If these issues are important enough they should be considered at this level, then the American people should know about them as well, so that they can benefit and be knowledgeable about what's going on.
Yeah, so I appreciate the 30,000-foot question because I'm a philosopher, and I think that the questions that we've gotten here today really illustrate why these educational materials are so important, because we hear from all different kinds of professionals who are seeking to address the ethical aspects of what their students are thinking about and what they're going to be encountering in their professional lives, and that's really the nature of ethics. It's values are what make life worth living, and so if they're everywhere, we're going to have to figure out the really complex ways to think about them. And so I really want to thank all the people who are watching today for asking questions and for really making us think about how to make these materials as useful as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. And that is about all the time we have for questions today. If you have any follow-up questions, please email us at education@bioethics.gov, and we will be emailing an evaluation of today's webinar. Your feedback is critical to helping us both make future webinars and future educational products useful, so please do fill it out for us. As I mentioned earlier, the recorded webinar will be available on bioethics.gov within a few days, and we will send the link out to everyone who registered for today's session. Thanks again to our speakers and to our audience for participating. Have a great day.